Okay, so in this video I will show the example of how easy it is now after we implemented loose coupling to replace our repository with a different repository, and also how to implement the client-side caching. So to get started, first thing that I will do is I'll go ahead and add the project here that we already have for our client-side caching. But before we start that, I would like to just really quickly explain the decorator pattern. So basically the caching repository is going to be a wrapper that will wrap the in this case service repository, but we can put whichever repository you want. So basically we instantiate our repository interface with the service repository in our composition root, and then we inject it into the caching repository. So now the caching repository constructor requires repository interface, which we instantiate with which type of service repository, which type of repository we want to use. So that's why we have sort of a wrapper, or two things that we can do. And this is called decorator pattern. Okay, so here I added the person repository caching decorator, and I can just really quickly go over it. So it, like I said earlier, it takes in person repository interface, and it has the constructor that we have to use, that we have to inject the person repository in, and I usually like to put a constructor first. And then it has some caching methods here. Validate cache, which creates the cache. If there's no cache available, it just sends like this little no data available thing. So very simple client-side caching here in our wrapper. So this is called decorator pattern because it makes this like a wrapper that now we can plug into this any service that we want, any repository I mean that we want, and it will work. So in order for us to use this caching, what we need to do is first go into our people viewer and create a reference, first of all, to our caching decorator. And then here we need to go ahead and add the using statement. And then what we need to do is we need to instantiate the type of service that we want, which is a repository that we want. And let's try it since we already only have service repository now. So instantiate this, and now we go ahead and do the same thing here with a different variable. Caching repository, which now requires the actual repository. So what we did now is we created an instance of people repository, and we wanted a service repository through our interface. Then using the same interface, we went ahead and injected our repository into our caching repository. Now caching repository can actually do some other things to it, but it's still the same. So it kind of plugs in, wraps, and returns, because it itself actually, like we said, it has to implement the app person repository. So it's a very clever whole another world here that can happen. So now we should be able to build and run this, and when we kill the IIS, we have 30 seconds that we can still use the data. Oh, great. Okay, so the error was because earlier I turned the IIS Express off, so it wasn't really running. So if we run it, fetch data, now we have the data. We can clear it, we can fetch it again. But now what we can do is we can go ahead and turn off our people service stop it, and we can clear data and fetch data. And there's an issue here because obviously when we stop the service, the caching is not really working. So let me take a look. Actually, the problem here is that I haven't been sending the cached version. I've been sending the actual repository, so when I would turn the service it wouldn't run. So that's even another way of testing, is now when I put in the cached version, I'm going to send this, make sure the server is up and running, which is not. So in order to get it running, we go to the actual service here, and we'll start a new instance. We can stop it. I mean, we can just kill that and stop it, but it'll still be running. We can see it here. In IIS Express is still running. So now Control F5, running our application. Fetch data should work. We don't know if you're caching or not. I mean, second time am I calling it? Am I calling the service? I'm pretty sure I'm calling the cached because it's so quick. But in order to make sure, we have 30 seconds to go ahead and stop this site, clear the data, fetch the data, clear the data, fetch the data. I guess 30 seconds already expired and we get no data available because the cache has expired. So for 30 seconds our data was still available, and if we try to run the service again, there's the data again. Service is running. Stop it. We should have 30 seconds of the data still. After 30 seconds, this data is going to be gone because our service is stopped. And there it is, 30 seconds expired, data is gone, and no data available. So that's how easily it's to implement the client-side caching. Now let's take a real quick look on how we can plug in different repositories here. So let's go ahead and add another project here, not a new one, the existing project, and we add the person repository CSV. So this repository basically loads instead of the service, it will actually load all the data from the text file. So go ahead and build it real quick just to make sure that DLL is in a bin. And then what we need to do in our people viewer, we need to add a reference. All we need to do is add a reference to this CSV. Let's get rid of the caching. Actually, I just delete it. And add a using statement here for our person repository.csv. And then we'll call the new CSV. I think it's all capital CSV repository. And we pass it back in here. People repository. And when we bring the DLL over here, what we need to do is we need to make sure that in our bin we actually have, in a debug, we have that text file, and I don't see it here, so I'll go ahead and copy it really quick in here. So I just copied in a debug of our bin directory. So now we should be able to see different data, and that's just by plugging another repository, and this repository could have been written by another developer. So it's different because there's a Jeremy Clark here in the list. And finally, for SQL repository, what I did, and I had to write this project, I created a person context class that inherits from DB context, and that's all part of system data. That entity has a DB set of type person, and a person object I had to go ahead and add the ID. So this DB set is basically automatically added this table to the database. Connection to database is right here in connection string of a root application, which is a people viewer, and I used the world database, so it just added the table without migrations, which is kind of weird. I don't know, I'll have to look more into this. And then what else happened here is that our SQL repository now simply just calls the context people to list, and that's our SQL repository. And then in people viewer we did the same thing. We created the reference and ran it, fetch data, and now it comes from a SQL very easily, and somebody else could have wrote this SQL repository. We could have a developer just writing the repositories. And this is the video on benefits of having dependency injection, how easily it is to implement other things, and you know, it makes the things way more smoother and easier to plug in.